Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics again, and I'm here with a kind of part 2 tutorial. This is following up on the video that I did earlier today called Using Scalar for Modal Interchange. And in this early video, I talked about kind of classical chord theory, sweet sounding chord theory, chords that resolve nicely to a finish and really outline the tonic of the chord. And I had this section about harmonic theory in a nutshell that, sort of encapsulated the basic rules for that kind of chord theory. I made a note here that there are other types of cadences. There's more than just this 5-to-1 and 4-to-1 cadence. And in this first video, I really focused on this cadence because it's a very specific and common type of cadence. And it makes effectively a sweet sounding kind of chord progression that resolves and has movement and then comes to a nice resolution at the end. But as I hinted here, there are other rules, there's other types of cadences that give us a different kind of chord progression. So we're going to talk about that today, and it's going to be a much shorter video. Hopefully you've watched this one first and you have this as a baseline, and now we're going to talk about something called a half cadence and how that helps us build chord progressions that are suspenseful and kind of never-ending. So endless suspenseful chord progressions. That's what we're going to talk about today, and it's just a slight variation or nuance of the basic concepts I talk about in this first video. So if you haven't watched this yet, go watch this first. Yes, it's an hour long, but it's a lot of chord theory distilled into a single hour, so that's actually pretty good. But let's get on to the good stuff now. So in the first video, I did a lot of using this kind of summary of the rules in this notepad. But what I'm going to do now is show you what was hiding at the bottom, because we're going to talk about this in a separate kind of section. I really want to disconnect the idea of using chord progressions that are based around the standard cadences, 5-to-1 and 4-to-1, and the way you write chord progressions around that. Today, we're going to scroll down here and talk about half cadences, and specifically how you use half cadences to make suspenseful and endless chord progressions, which are also pretty common, especially in EDM. So now we get into the stuff that, before I was showing you how to make spicy chord progressions that you don't hear that often in EDM, but can work really well. Well, now we're going to talk about the more common stuff you hear and why it works and how to understand it. And it's really simple. We're going to build on what we had before. The basic idea here is that a full cadence is kind of like the period at the end of a sentence, okay? A full cadence brings you back really strongly to the tonic, to the one, and they make it really clear that this chord progression is rooted in the one chord, right? And this is the scale, and this is the home key of the song, right? Very emphatic period at the end of a sentence, and they really give a feeling of completion and resolution to the whole little progression you write. By contrast, half cadences are much more like a comma in the middle of a sentence. They leave you hanging, they leave you feeling like the progression's incomplete and is going to continue, right? But it doesn't. And instead, it just wraps around to the beginning again. And so it gives us this feeling of endlessness, like it wants to resolve, but it never does. It just keeps going and going and going. And this is actually a good sounding kind of chord progression too. It's just different. That's why I like to call it suspenseful or endless chord progressions. So let's look at what a half cadence is. A full cadence is anything that's basically goes from 5-to-1 or 4-to-1 in the chord progression. The fifth chord to the first, or the fourth chord to the first in any given scale or key. A half cadence is a little different. It still revolves around 1s and 5s and 4s, but a half cadence ends on a 5 or a 4 instead of ending on a 1. And specifically, you can do anything and end on the 5, and that's one type of half cadence. Or you can do a 1 that ends on a 4 or a 5 that ends on a 4, and that's also kind of a half cadence. And so let's see a quick example of that. Right here in Scalar, we have a simple 4-chord progression, and it goes 1, 6, 7, 4, which, again, if you remember that 5 and 7 are effectively both a 5-chord in terms of chord progressions. 7 and 5 are interchangeable. 7's a substitution for 5. And let's look at that for people that need a refresher there. 1, 3, and 6 are all similar. 2 and 4 are related. 5 and 7 are related. And basically, whenever you see a 3-chord in a progression, you think of it as really being either a 1 or a 6. And if you see a 2, you think of it as really being a 4. And if you see a 7, you think of it as really being a 5. Okay? So this progression really is more like a 1, 6, 5, 4. Or, because the 6 can be a substitution for a 1, you could think of this as a 1, 5, 4 progression. And again, if we look at our list of half cadences, a 5 to a 4 is a kind of half cadence. So this is clearly a chord progression that ends in a half cadence of 5 to 4. And this is what it sounds like. It just goes on, and it never really resolves back to a feeling of home base at the end of the progression. Instead, the resolution comes after the suspenseful. That's suspenseful. Duh. And you're hanging right here. It's not resolved, but when you come back to the start and this 1 is here, now it feels like a kind of resolution. But see, it picks up and keeps going. So this kind of feeling and this kind of progression pretty much grew out of the rock era. Rock musicians kind of started using this first, and it's carried over since then. And the reason that rock musicians liked this kind of chord progression was that it had this endless feel, and the band could jam on it forever. You could have really, really long choruses with the lead guitarist noodling all over forever, and lots of different things going on. And it has this hypnotic, endless movement to it. You know, think about the psychedelic 60s, and it's just, you know, different avant-garde, breaking the rules, not having that solid, nice resolution that a lot of pop music in the 50s and early 60s had. So it was kind of avant-garde, edgy, different, and it's stuck. I mean, it sounds good. It's hypnotic, and this is why these kinds of endless chord progressions are popular in dance music, because, you know, you could play a techno song or a house song that goes on for 20 minutes with a progression like this, and it's just endless and hypnotic and droning, and it's not telling a story so much as setting a mood that never ends, right? And keeps the suspense going in a way. So that's why these are popular. And in fact, there's a competing kind of new scale and chord plugin called Captain Chords by Mixed in Key. I don't have it, unfortunately, because it's not available for Windows yet, and I run on Windows. But I will be grabbing it as soon as it is available for Windows, because it's a good alternative and a slightly different purpose, really, than Scalar. And one of the things Captain Chords does is it offers you this really long list of baked, simple 4-part chord progressions. And we're looking at the list of minor progressions right now, or at least the first part of these minor progressions. It kind of goes on off to the right of the page. I just took a screenshot here. It has some interesting looking chords in it. So we're going to talk about some of these and explain how they work, either in the context of the types of full standard cadences we talked about in my other video that end on a resolved kind of feeling, or in the context of chord progressions that end on a half cadence and therefore have this sort of endless, never-ending, suspenseful feeling to them. So this progression I'm playing here is straight out of this list. And again, it has that endless feel. And what's really going on is it's either a 1-1-5-4, or it could truly be a 1-6-5-4, because the basic rules for suspenseful chord progressions are very similar to the rules for sweet sounding chord progressions. You always think about the cadence first. The cadence tells you what's really going on. So anything that ends basically in a 4 or a 5 is probably an endless chord progression. So in this case, a 7 is really a 5. So this ends in a 5-4 cadence. The 4 is a big clue that this is probably a half cadence. And then sure enough, if we look at our list of half cadences, there's 5-4. So this is clearly ending in a half cadence. Now, the other important rule about kind of suspenseful chord progressions is they almost always, like always start with a 1 chord. Remember when we talked about kind of older, sweeter sounding chord progressions, they usually start with a 1, but you could start with almost any chord and it'll work because it's the cadence at the end that brings you back to the 1 and tells you what the song key is. But in a suspenseful, endless kind of chord progression, you pretty much always have to start with a 1 because it's the start of the chord progression that is your home base, that is the center, that tells listeners what the key of the song is, right? And what the root note is. So they always end with a 5 or a 4, a half cadence. They always start with a 1. And then the middle can be anything you want, like literally any other chord you want in the middle spot. So if this were an 8, if this were a chord progression that went for 8 bars or 16 bars and went through a bunch more chord changes, again, all that would matter is the last cadence at the end would have to be a half cadence, and it would have to start with a 1, but everything in between could be anything you want, pretty much. Okay, and then the last kind of weird note about these suspenseful chord progressions, these half cadence chord progressions, is that, and these are the only ones that can get away with it, a simple progression that's just a, and let me actually clear this out and do this. A 1 and a 5, all by itself, is a complete, comprehensive chord progression in a suspenseful endless style, right? That's a solid chord progression right there. Let's listen to it. I mean, you can make a whole song out of that. It's a perfectly fine chord progression. It doesn't tell a story, it doesn't move, it doesn't have resolution. It's just this endless thing, but it sounds great. You can write almost any kind of melody over that. Likewise, a 1-4 is a perfectly good endless progression. So anything that's just a 1-5 and a 1-4 half cadence all by itself with no other chords, a perfectly good suspenseful endless chord progression. And you can even do the 5 and the 4, the 1 and the 4, or the 1 and the 5 in reverse. So let's check that out. Here's the 1 and the 4. I mean, you could have a techno song that just goes on and on like that, right? We could switch, we could reverse them. Let's start on the 4. See how it works? Even though it's starting on the 4, you still know what the home base is because this is a tension and this is a resolution. The 4 always wants to move to the 1, so it's clear that this is the tonal center of the chord progression, even though it's just 2 chords. And again, this could be the 5 going first. Okay, it works perfectly. And you can still do modal interchange. Let's go to the major scale and bring in a major 5 here. What's this sound like? It's a major 5 and a minor 1. We've got modal interchange going on now. One of these chords is in a different key than the other one, right? But what's it sound like? Okay, that's a little rough sounding, but I bet you could find a substitution for this 5 that might sound pretty good. Let's try it. We're going to go to the chord variations in the major scale where we're borrowing this chord from. We're going to go to the 5. And let's try some other ones. That's pretty good. Let's try that. And here's the other trick about 5-1 and 4-1 like chord progressions that are composed only of a half cadence. You can extend these things and actually make a kind of movement. So this is still a 5-1. It's just we're going to draw that 5 out and spread it across 3 different flavors of 5 to the 1 and then back to the 5 again. Right? It works. We could find a substitution for this original 1. Let's go back to the G minor. Let's try a minor 7 there instead of just a triad minor. See, totally works. And all this is, when you look at it, even though it's 4 chords and they're 4 different chords, it's still just a 5-1 half cadence in reverse chord progression, an endless chord progression. It's a little rough sounding, but with the right specific voicings and inversions. I always do that. Let's try something like that. Right? Sounds a little like something Kraftwerk would have done back in the day. Edgy, not your usual fare because it's got modal interchange and a weird structure to it, but it's still at its heart just a simple 5-1 half cadence. And that alone is a perfectly good chord progression. So let's go back to this. That's the basic idea. And now we're just going to sort of walk through this list, talk it through a little bit, just a couple examples from here, and then maybe I'll actually put some of these into scalar and show you what they sound like. So the first thing to remember is if you want to really understand a chord progression that you've dropped in or you've grabbed from a MIDI file or that you've just come up with yourself, and then you're wondering, well, what the hell is this song key? Which one's my tonic chord and so on? If you want to understand what's going on, you always look at the last chord first because that tells you the story. So this is a 6 chord. Well, remember, 6 is a substitution for 1 or 3. Chord progressions never end on a 3. So this chord progression is actually ending on a 1. So this is a 1, 5, 1, 1. Okay? That's exactly what it is. This is a 1, 5, 1 half cadence. And it's just drawn out with a couple variations of 1 over here so it doesn't sound boring. Let's try it. Let's see what that sounds like. So it's a minor 1, minor 5, major 3, major 6, specifically these 3 chords, and they're all triads. So let's draw that out real quick. We're in G minor. 1, 5. So 1. So let's go to diatonic. 1, 5. Oh, is it 3, 3 and 6. So there's our major third, and there's our major 6. Okay, so this is that chord progression. Sounds great. It doesn't resolve. It's an endless, suspenseful chord progression. It only resolves briefly when it comes back to the start again for the 1. So it's a 1-5 progression because this is really a 1 and this is really a 1. And we can prove that. Let's put a 1 here and a 1 here again. Let's do some little inversions. That's a little low. Let's move this up an octave, and let's try that. See, it works. Now compare it with the original again. Here's the, what was it, 3 and 6. It has that same basic feel as it did when I put those 2 1s in here. Let's put these over here, and let's set up those inversions again. Okay. Yeah, that one. So now compare that with see how these just feel like slightly different flavors of these 1 chords? That's why we call these substitutions for the 1. They're possible substitutions. And certainly if the 6 is ever in the very last spot of a chord progression, it's really a 1. Now if it were in the middle, it might be a 6, but we're just going to not go there right now. We're just going to make the point that if you see the 6 in the ending spot, it's really a 1. It's always a 1. And, you know, that's how this chord progression works. Let's look at another one. I'm going to clear this. We'll come back to the list of Captain Chords keys. So this one here ends in a 5. So right off the bat, that tells me this is a half cadence. What we really have here is a 1, 1, 5, 5, which again is just a simple half cadence composed of a 1 to a 5, and then going back at the start again to the 1, right? So even though it looks like 4 chords, when you think about what it really is, by looking at, you know, these kind of rules for substitution, it's literally just a 1-5 half cadence. So let's hear it. Which one was it again? Ended in a 5, this one. 1, 1, 5, 5. 1 major third, major 7, minor 5. So let's go find that. 1, 3, 7, 5. Major 7, 5. Okay. Right? It's perfectly good sounding chord progression. But again, it's ending on the 5, so it's not really resolving. It's that endless round and round circle kind of feel. But again, if we do some substitution, this is really a 1 and this is really a 5. So let's set that up. Let's put this 5 over here. And let's do a little inversion to make these two different from each other. Okay, stick with that, and then this 5 here, we'll take it down an octave. Okay, so 1, 1, 5, 5. 1, 1. Listen to the difference. They're sharing a lot of the same notes, right? There's at least one or two notes that are similar. That's why they're good substitutions for each other. So they sound kind of the same tonally. So for the 7 and the 5, instead of, it could be, again, the 7 shares some notes with the 5, so they're very similar. So they basically can just interchange for each other. So listen to the difference. Versus right? It's the same basic movement, the same basic feeling of cadence. And when you boil it down, it's just 1, 1, 5, 5. It's just these are substitutions for the 1 and the 5. So it's basically a 1, 5 half cadence broken across 4 pieces with some substitutions in there. Okay. So that's really, I'm going to let you guys go, and it's late for me, so I'm going to call this quits. But, you know, when you see chord combinations like this, just remember that they're all fitting the rules of a regular full cadence or half cadence. And the only difference is if it ends effectively on a 5, or if it ends on a 4, it's one of those endless kind of chord progressions, and it's always going to start with a 1, and it'll work great. Okay, so this one here is a 1, 5, 5, 4. And remember, 5 to 4 is one of our half cadences. Let's look for another one that ends in a 4 or 5. Here's a 1, 1, 4, 5. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a 4. 1, 1, 4, 5. Did I put 4, 5 on this list? Let's check. Yeah, anything to 5 is a half cadence. So this is definitely one of those endless kind of chord progressions. But now if we look at this one, right below it, this is a 1, 1, 5, 1. So that's one of our original mellow, sweet-sounding ends in resolution chord progressions. So let's refresh our memory and just look one more time at these two chords real quick. 1, 3, 4, 5. Let's put that right there. 1, 3, 4, 5. And there's something special about this particular 1, 3, 4, 5. You'll notice in the key of G minor, the 5 is a minor, but this one has a major 5. So what's happening here, again, in this substitution, even though Captain Keys will never tell you this, this is using modal interchange. It's using one chord that isn't in the key of G minor. So let's go find a 5 that's just a straight up D major triad. Okay, so we know how to do that. Let's look at the major scale first. Sure enough, there's a 5 that's a D major. Drop that down here. Come back to the minor scale, and we can see 1, 3, 4, 5 major. It's not in the scale. It's outside the scale. So this is a modal interchange. And yet it sounds great. And because it ends on a half cadence with a 5, it's one of those endless things. Over and over and over and over and over. It doesn't go anywhere. It's just a feeling. It's hypnotic. It's droning. It's great for dance music, certain types of dance music. It's not good if you want to tell a story. You wouldn't want to use a progression like this in future bass, probably. But it'd be great in house, techno, bounce, right? That kind of stuff. So again, hopefully this has helped. It's shown you a new type of cadence and a new type of thinking about a kind of endless chord progression that's very common and is very easy to adapt to EDM. And Captain Chords is very much built for EDM and pop. It's not very soulful or hip-hoppy. It's very much straight up EDM and pop. And so it has a lot of those endless type chord progressions that end in half cadences. But it's great. It's good stuff, and it's helpful to understand why these chord progressions work. You can always boil any of these down to either, the rules for full cadences and a sweet sounding chord progression that resolves nicely, or you can boil it down to something that uses a half cadence at the end and has a kind of suspenseful, endless chord progression. Everything boils down to that. And I guess the last thing to note is that because these are 4-chord patterns, you could string 2 of these together. Like you could start with this one set of 4 chords that ends in a half cadence, like the comma in the middle of a sentence. And then you could make the next 4 chords be this progression right here. So then it would end in a full cadence going from 5 to 1, and it would have resolution before it rolled again to the start. So picture this: 1, 1, 4, 5, 1, 1, 5, 1. Or since this 3 chord is really happening in the middle, not at the start and not at the cadence, we can just call it a 3 chord, because that's kind of what it is anyway. So let's lay this out one more time. So we've already got the first 4 chords in there. Let's put the 1, 3, 5, 1 in. So we're going to use minor 1, major 3, major 5, minor 1, major 3, major 5. Yep, cool. All right, so let's go to the major scale. That doesn't have a major 3. We're going to have to borrow that from even a different place, but let's grab the major 5 here, and it ends on the minor 1 again. Let's go find a major 3. Probably in Mixolydian. Nope. Phrygian? Yeah, Phrygian. Okay, so this progression, it's in G minor. It's got 8 chords. It ends in a regular cadence, and it's borrowing 2 different chords from 2 different modes. This came from, I think, the major scale, Ionian, and this one came from Phrygian, was it? Lydian, Phrygian, one of those. Anyway, and this is what it would sound like end to end. See how it has that sense of resolution at the end? And now granted, it's a little plain sounding. I would want to play with other chord variations for some of these, and interval inversions. Why can't I remember that term? Would play with things to make it move a little more smoothly, but you get the point. It sounds good. It tells a story. It ends on a solid resolution. It really drives home that this is G minor, and then it starts the story over again. And meanwhile, this half cadence in the middle is just like a comma in the middle of a sentence. It's like 2 thoughts strung together to make a full sentence. So that's everything I got, and that's pretty much, between what I showed you in the other video and what I've talked about in this video, that's like 95% of all the chord theory you're ever going to need as an EDM person. The other 5% are for jazz people and classical people. This is it. This is all of it. And it's not that hard once you wrap your head around it. So I will post all of this new stuff, this additional stuff rather. I'll post this in the liner notes for the video, and you can copy it out, put it wherever you want, make notes about it, and this is all the chord theory you're pretty much ever going to need right here. Thank you. Bye-bye.